is just underglaze and clear. And you can see the really bright reds and bright colors. Underglaze is basically a colored slip. This is also underglaze and clear. And the underglazes are really, really bright. We've got reds, we've got yellows, we've got pinks. So here's a super bright red. These are the test tiles on white clay. We're working with all white clay. We used to also work with a red clay. These are the test tiles for the red clay. They look totally different, don't they? Totally different. You can layer underglazes. These are being affected by the chemistry of the clay. This red clay has a lot of iron in it. So as it's going through the fire, those colors are changing. And it's also very dark. This is that same clay. And you can see how dark the clay is. So the underglazes are not as bright on a darker clay. So you always want to use a test tile. The test tiles will show you exactly what that's going to look like after it's fired. Before it's fired, it's a different thing. All the underglazes live right here over the sink. There are little pallets. Please clean them after. Because you only need a little tiny bit. There are brushes. So all of these are for the underglazes. So let me grab Amethyst, a Sunset Pink, and Fiesta Turquoise. And each one of these has a number and a name. So on the test tile, this is Fiesta Turquoise. It's a little different, not quite. It gets darker. So we can see that's a little bit different. Some of them very much so. And depending on what glaze you use with it, we have a no craze clear, which is really glossy. And then there's a satin matte, which is more matte, less glossy. And take a look at what happens to neon green. So these are two different glazes. So the test tiles are showing you no glaze, no craze clear. Oh, I'm sorry. This one's no craze clear. You can see the label there. And this is the satin matte. And you can kind of see from the reflection, that's a, look at that neon green. Whoa, that's army green. That became a whole different color. And then look at the Morocco, whoa, look at that, the Morocco red. So most of them are about the same, but there's a couple of them that are very different. In this room is the Glaze Room. We will start going in there next week. Everybody has to complete their quiz first. There's a little quiz on glaze and underglaze, and then we'll start to work with glazes. They're even more finicky, and you definitely want to look at the test tile to see what that's going to look like. And in the wall in there, there's all these test tiles that are showing you exactly what the glazes look like. Now, I recommend that you start with underglaze. It's very similar to painting. It's similar to what we're used to, and we have a lot of colors. You can, really make these colorful and paint, super detailed. So I recommend your first piece, or even your first couple, you try the underglaze process. Okay? Look at these little details on that. Oh my gosh. Wowzer. I think this was Hayden. Hayden was really good at painting. This is what happens, you're like really good at painting, and then you take pottery. So there's all these lovely details. All right. And after you paint with underglaze, you can then add a glaze to the piece. Glaze is glass. Think of glaze as glass. That is what makes the piece food safe. That is what makes it so we can eat and drink out of it. You can wipe away glaze, but this is also wax. This has a wax resist. You will have to wax the bottom of all of your pieces when you're applying glaze so that they don't stick to the kiln. If you look at the bottom of this piece, see how it's not shiny? That's raw clay. There's no glaze there. It turns into glass in the kiln. So if there's any glaze here, it glues itself to the shell. There's many pieces that got broken. When we get to lids and boxes, the entire group glued their lids to their boxes because they forgot to keep the glaze out. So depending on what you're making, you really have to think about where you're applying that glaze. All of your projects, you'll turn in the glaze pieces at the end of this class. Okay, so you'll be turning everything in just as raw clay. And we'll worry about the glazing at the end. At the very end, I'll ask that you turn in your best 3 pieces. One of them with underglaze, and the others can be any glazes you want. The glaze should complement the piece. It should make the piece better. This is a perfect example of this. These little red dots painted over here is really is beautiful. I think this one too, the glaze, it's even a box. It just brings it to life. But there are times that a glaze can just ruin a piece. Texture is a really good example. This was actually from the first plate. We were doing slab plates. And all she did was create this texture. It's just beautifully done. This is underglaze. So the whole thing is painted with underglaze. But you see how the darker blue, it just kind of brings that out? There are glazes which are really solid, and they'll cover everything. And for a piece like this, it would have ruined all the sculpture. So depending on whatever your piece is, you'll want to pick the right glaze to help finish that piece. I recommend to come in during open studio, spend some time looking at the test tiles, looking at some of the examples, and really thinking about that. It can be a part of your sketchbook where you're taking notes and thinking about, okay, what colors do I want to use? What glaze do I want to use? And bring everything in and get it to the Bisque shelf. You'll need to Bisque Fire everything. And there's some pieces over there that look colorful. You have to bisque fire the underglaze. It's clay. So everything that's clay has to be fired. The bisque fire process is a slower fire, it's a cooler fire. It helps prepare the piece for the glaze and the final firing. It's a lot of stress we're going to put that clay under. We're going to put that clay up to about 1500 degrees from 0. That's a lot of stress. All the air is coming out of the clay. That is also the reason you want the piece to be as uniform as possible. Because different thickness, thinness, a really thick piece of clay may explode in the kiln. So a lot of this is about making sure the pieces make it through the kiln. So if you're coming in, if you haven't made class, make sure you get everything on the Bisque Fire shelf, and please try to sign or put your name on the bottom. Carve it in, write it in. This one's a little tiny, but there's a tiny signature there. In some way with your needle tool. See, it's interesting, a lot of the pieces that got left and lost didn't quite have a name on them. If the clay is still wet enough, you can carve your name into the bottom. But make sure you try to get your name on the bottom. If it's super dry, you can paint it on with underglaze. You can take a little teeny brush and some underglaze, and it can just be your initials. But you'll want to have your name, your initials, and then get it to the bisque shelf. After class, I fire everything. We have all the kilns out there. And then they come back, and they're all bisque fired. The color will change a little bit. We could add water to this, and it's not going to melt. I can't quite drink out of it, but it'll hold water, and it's ready to absorb glaze. So if you watch, if I pour that out, you can literally see the water just disappear. Because all the water has been burned out of this in the kiln. For sculpture, this is really important too, because it really helps prepare the clay. The glaze firing is an even higher temperature. Okay, so for today, we'll make sure everything gets signed. After it gets bisque fired, we'll talk about that step next. So I think this is enough for this step here. So we can probably cut that, and I'll send that out as a little announcement. Thank you, Dan.